Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing great as always. In this video, we got a story from Northern Ontario. There seems to be a lot going on there, doesn't there? So yeah, pull up a stump and let's jump into it. Thank you for watching. This was a story that my uncle would always tell me as a kid during summer vacations to entertain the children. The following was treated as the unadulterated truth by the entire family, especially my uncle, who was genuinely discouraged by the family from telling absolutely anyone. I can't possibly do the story justice, especially given how intense he would tell the story, but I'm gonna try, so here goes. So this would have happened when he was going into his teen years. He was somewhere between 12 and 14. He was growing up in this shitty suburban town in Northern Ontario, and for obvious privacy reasons I won't say the name. Growing up there meant complete boredom for any young person involved. The most you could do was play baseball or fish in one of the local rivers. Kids who didn't start underage drinking or narcotics at this young age were drawn to the woods as a form of entertainment. The town was spread out, but not heavily populated. It just meant that there was a bunch of empty houses and empty lots. My uncle has a best friend called T and a younger sister called S. Obviously not going to give their real names. Should probably clarify that S is T's sister, not my uncle's. The wording is kind of confusing. These kids would screw around in the woods constantly. They'd block up rivers and making these really terrible forts that would collapse within not very long. My uncle had a fascination with mapping out the whole place, constantly plotting new ones, whether something new was discovered or not. A section of town that was not so populated was affectionately and historically referred to as Weston. Thus, this began the stories of the Weston Manimal, an urban legend in the shitty suburban town that went way, way back. It went by other names, given how many generations that this story was passed down to, but my uncle's generation called it Manimal after the TV show that was popular at the time. One neighbor owned the DVDs of the first season that he ordered from the States. He would have TV parties with the show. In the western section of the town, the dogs would show up dead, and trash was rummaged through on almost a weekly basis. This combined with the legend of a wild man or animal or thing person in the town made kids go crazy with their adventuring, just trying to find it. Senile old people in the town would tell them stories about seeing a pale humanoid figure in the woods. My uncle and his friends wouldn't always believe them, but sometimes they would take what they say to heart. The parents were advised to educate their kids on the dangers of the woods, not because of the legend of the manimal, but because there were some genuinely dangerous bears and coyotes in the woods that could seriously screw a kid up. So kids played this off as, quote, protecting us from the manimal. Imagination and fear in the kids got so bad that some teachers had to sit all the kids down and tell them that the manimal was a stupid old legend that the town made up many generations ago. This just made my uncle and his friend T want to prove it even more. One day a kid from their class says that their dog went missing and is asking everyone if they saw it or not. My uncle thinks that the Western Manimal must have gotten the kid's dog. They decide they want to check their maps to see which places in the woods that they haven't gone before. There's this one big old hilly area in the middle that they generally stayed away from that's about 1 kilometer wide. And the only reason why they hadn't explored this area yet was because one of the rivers that flows around the town wraps around the area, and it gets too wide and deep to wade across easily. On the other side of the area was thick brush that no one made a path through, and they also couldn't get through it easily even if they wanted to. But they decide that it's time now to try and explore this area. If the Weston Manimal isn't there, then it doesn't exist. Being 12 years old and stupid, they decide to begin their expedition to find the manimal. They bring rations of sandwiches, a carton of milk, and 4 cans of Pepsi. And they didn't bring any flashlights or even think of it because they were probably stupid, but they bring binoculars to search for it. T decides to include his little sister S, who was a couple years younger than them. The three begin construction on this really terrible boat-looking thing made of cheap wood and glue. They ended up being more of a raft that just kind of had the vague shape of a boat. At least that's how my uncle described it to me. This is what they would use to cross the river, since it would take too long to cross any other way through the thick brush. They grab 2 paddles and put on their stupid red and blue ball caps to begin their epic journey across the river. They leave just before dusk one day without telling their parents, because you could do anything as a child back then apparently. They start walking and carrying their really awful boat thing and struggle all the way through the woods. They pass their forts that saw many a knights in battle. They pass the old gravel pit where they'd light gasoline on fire just for fun, a pretty expensive hobby nowadays. Eventually they would make it to the river, probably about 40 feet to cross this section. They whip out their paddles and start paddling, and all 3 of them pile into the hull, but it's obviously way too much weight for this little raft. The little thing starts leaking as soon as they paddle, and being stubborn, dumb kids, they think that it will make it there and back. By the time they get to the other side, the boat's completely sunk and they're all soaked. They still have some daylight left, and they decide that they'll just try to head back through the thick brush afterwards, despite the time it's going to take. T tells his sister to check out the other side of the area, while the 2 of them go up around the hills. The 2 of them march up the dry gravel hills to this kind of miniature cliff-looking thing. It's like a cliff face on the other side. They're looking down for any signs, but they can't really make anything out. They patiently stay quiet and wait for S to come back, but eventually they hear something down the cliffside of the hill. They both look and see something moving down near a hole in another smaller hill. Something seems to be moving down by the stream of flowing water. My uncle puts his binoculars up to his eyes, and when telling the story, he always chokes up at this point. He looks down at this small greenish-gray humanoid-looking thing that seems to be completely naked, roughly the same size as my uncle, about 5 feet tall at the time. It's incredibly skinny, arms that were much too long for its body. It had nasty, matted black hair on its head, at least a foot long on one side, waving and kind of scruffy, obscuring its face. It had cuts and bruises all over its dirty, weird fleshy body, and almost looked emaciated. It was dragging something behind it with its incredibly long fingers and even longer overgrown nails. A cut open golden retriever, definitely the missing dog that belonged to my uncle's classmate. It stops for a minute. My uncle and T are dead silent, and then it looks up in their direction. My uncle was still staring at this thing through the binoculars, and with what little sunlight was left, he could make out the face. He describes it the exact same way every time he's told the story. Its head was way too round and big for its body, almost spherical looking, but with an underdeveloped forehead. It had a super skinny neck with what appeared to be a giant Adam's apple. The long, scruffy hair on its head was stained with blood and dirt. It rolled down its face and obscured some of it, its eyes were bulbous, black, and sticking out too far. Its mouth was way too wide to be normal, going from one side of the head to the other. Its skin on its face was darker and really tight, almost like it was stretched, and it didn't have a nose, it didn't have any eyebrows, it didn't even have any ears. My uncle has no idea how long he looked at this thing. Eventually it calmly walked off toward its hole in the ground. T was shaken and tried to get my uncle to talk. T didn't get as good of a look at the thing, but he did see the shape. My uncle was borderline comatose, just unresponsive. T just shoved him down the hill. They made a bunch of noise, but they needed to find S as soon as possible and get the hell out of there and get back home. The sun is done going down at this point and it starts to get dark. They start running towards the other side of the area where they sent S. T is starting to panic because they can't find her. My uncle starts to become more responsive as they try to look for her. They don't want to make noise in case they attract that thing over to where they are. T starts to whisper, kind of like that whisper shout, calling out his sister's name. My uncle stops him from making noise. They can hear the thing from the hole start to walk. It definitely sounds like it's walking towards them through the brush. They know it's not S because of the noises it's making. They sprint back the way they came, around the opposite side of the area, closer to the thick brush. They hide in some bushes for a bit once they're on the other side to catch their breath. S isn't calling out to them, but if she was lost in the woods, she should be making noise. This makes T scared as hell for his sister. He's like, he doesn't know what happened to her. A quicker way through the brush was closer to where they saw the thing dragging the dog. They devised a plan to get home as quickly as possible and tell their parents so that they can come into the woods with guns and find her. They wait a few more minutes as it gets darker and darker. The two start running for the brush but hear a noise. They both freeze and they duck behind this fallen tree. The thing from before comes out into a clearing. It can't see my uncle or T. It's dragging something else. It's a much smaller dog. It looked brown, but they couldn't really make it out since it was almost completely dark at this point. The little dog is bound with some sort of rope or crude vines. It's squealing and barking up a storm. This thing starts to torture the little dog, cutting it with its nails in certain spots and pinning its head down. All the while this thing bobbed its head up and down, making this raspy, almost laughing-like sound. They could barely make it out, but it almost looked like that the thing was smiling about this. It started skinning the dog alive and tearing at its meat. Eventually the dog stops moving as the thing begins to eat it. The two slowly begin inching away, trying to make as little noise as possible. As they're walking away, my uncle looks behind them. The thing is standing straight up looking at them. My uncle panics and screams and starts pushing T to run. The thing begins to chase them. All my uncle can do is run. He gets split up from T. After a few minutes of running, he was still in the area and didn't make it through the thick brush. He only ran along the edge. He can hear T screaming off in the distance with some other inhuman sounds that he couldn't place. My uncle tries to run to find S while the thing is distracted. He runs to right where they sent S when they showed up. Not a trace. Eventually, he finds her backpack. It's slightly ripped on one side. He gets really worried and his stomach sinks. He begins to look farther in the direction of the backpack and he runs past some trees. T's screaming is starting to get louder. My uncle sees something small and long underneath a branch. It's an arm. It's S's arm. It's like it just tore it off her body. Next to it was a shard of her shirt. He begins to go into a blind panic at this point and is just running in any direction. Trees and bushes start cutting at his face and his legs. He keeps tripping and stumbling in the pitch black woods. After running for what seems like hours, he finds a dirt road he recognizes. He begins sprinting alongside of it in the direction of home. He hears more screaming, but he isn't sure if it's real anymore or if it's just his imagination. He's running and bleeding at the same time. It's exhausting him. Eventually he makes it to the town hall, and he just goes the usual route from there to his house. My uncle runs into his porch at full speed and collapses while trying to get the door open. Around this point there's a gap in his memory. He can't visualize any of this, but this is what his parents, my grandparents, told him. From my grandparents' perspective, he had been out playing for much longer than he should have been. Once the sun went down, they called all of their neighbors to see if they knew where he was, Eventually they called the police and asked for an officer to come to their house to help find my uncle. When they were there talking to the officer about what they should do, my uncle ran to the porch and then ran straight into the door and knocked himself out. He was bleeding heavily from cuts on his legs and this gash on his arm. He was completely unresponsive and totally delirious, presumably from the running and adrenaline overdose. He was unresponsive and borderline comatose for the next several days. My grandparents thought that he had hit his head or something, but the local doctor said that it was more likely symptomatic of a severe traumatic experience. My uncle stayed in his bedroom until he started talking. This is when my uncle starts remembering things. T and S never came home that night. Their parents weren't the worrying type and didn't report it till the next day. My uncle was unresponsive during the search period, so no one got any information out of him on what happened to them. By the time my uncle was back to normal, some cops asked him what he was doing that night and what happened to T and S. At the time, my uncle tried to convince himself that it wasn't real. He also didn't want to get in trouble since it was his idea to look for the Weston manimal, so he kept his mouth shut. To this day, he says it was the biggest mistake of his life, but he was too traumatized to tell the truth. Kids in his class began to spread rumors that the manimal must have got T and S, that it climbed into their rooms in the middle of the night and killed them. Teachers and adults told these kids to be respectful to T and S. After a few weeks, my father was born, and my parents wanted a better life for their two sons in a bigger city. They moved shortly after, and my uncle never heard from TRS's family ever again. He claimed that he suffered from serious stress after the incident. He keeps having flashbacks and these waves of guilt of what happened to his friends. My uncle told us the story, though, much to our older relatives' dismay. It seems to have been maybe therapeutic in some way for him to get out his feelings about the incident rather than just repressing all of it. He left out the gory bits when we were younger, but as we got older, he told us more of the details of the story. He would avoid the details of the dogs and the arm, but the way he described the thing was always the same. His story never changed. It was burned into my brain as a kid and would sometimes give me nightmares. Now that I'm older, the story has a different effect on me. I'm not afraid of the story when I hear it. It's just one of the saddest and most disturbing family stories I've ever heard. I've never really believed in the paranormal or the supernatural, but every time he tells me this story, and he just describes everything the exact same way every time, and just the sadistic black eyes of this thing, I believe him. Well, that was a story. Kind of disturbing, a little bit. But what did you think? Did you think it was real? Or did you think it was fake? Do you think it was somewhere in between? Let me know down in the comments. And if you have any of your own stories, then there is an email down below where you can send them in. But yeah, if that story didn't give you a shiver, I don't know what will. So, on that note, I hope you have a good week, and I will see you next week, hopefully. And one video that I'd like to do is like alien abductions in Newfoundland, however you want to say it. So, if you want to see that video, then let me know in the comments as well. Anyways, I'll catch you next time.